Welcome to OOTO, the Out of the Office Investigation. I'm Dr. Anya Sharma.
And I'm Dr. Ben Carter.
Today, our investigation looks at the architecture of control, exploring how a 19th century pseudoscience didn't just die out, but seems to have found a new home, echoing in the most advanced laboratories of the 21st century. That really is the heart of it, isn't it, Anya? This deep-seated desire to categorize, to rank, and ultimately to control human life. It's an old ghost for sure, and it feels like it's inhabiting a very new, very powerful machine. I mean, the tech has evolved beyond anything its originators could have ever dreamed of. But that fundamental impulse, it might be unnervingly familiar.
It is, man. And that quote comes from someone who understands that power better than almost anyone. Jennifer Doudna is a pioneer of the CRISPR gene editing technology we're going to get to later. She said it herself. The power to control our species' genetic future is awesome and terrifying. This isn't some far-off future problem we're talking about. The power is right here, right now. And the real conflict is that all of us, as a society, are now facing the challenge of what on earth to do with it.
And that really brings us to the central question for today's investigation. Are we just repeating a really dark chapter of history, but this time with technology that makes the old tools look primitive? What we're going to do is map the disturbing parallels between the eugenics of the past and the genetic frontiers of today and trace what looks like an unbroken line of thinking that's evolved over centuries.
Right, and to tackle this, Anya, we've broken our analysis down into 6 main parts. We're going to start by defining what we mean by the architecture of control. Then we'll trace that line from skulls to scorecards. Third, we'll look at 2 very different models, purification, state versus market. Fourth, we'll get into the incredible leap from selection to design. Fifth, we'll have to confront the new genetic divide. And finally, we're going to be left with a huge question. Are we a sovereignty or a product?
Okay, so let's dive into part 1, the architecture of control. Ben, this is really the foundation for everything else, isn't it?
It's kind of the operating system running in the background of this whole story. It's the core belief that humanity can, and maybe even should, be categorized, ranked, and ultimately improved through direct intervention.
Exactly, Anya. And believe it or not, this story really kicks off during the Enlightenment, what we think of as the Age of Reason. So back in the 18th century, you have naturalists like Carl Linnaeus doing this massive project of classifying the entire natural world. But when he turned that same lens on humanity, he didn't just stop at geography. Linnaeus took this critical and, as it turns out, incredibly damaging next step. He assigned fixed psychological and moral traits to different groups, creating what was basically a hierarchy of man.
Yeah, and when you actually look at this table, Anya, the classifications are so obviously self-serving, it's almost hard to believe. So Europeans are described as gentle, acute, inventive, and, this is the key, governed by laws. So that establishes a baseline of rational order. But then you look at the others. Africans are labeled crafty, indolent, and governed by caprice, by pure impulse. This wasn't just some neutral academic exercise, it was a strategic tool designed to give a secular, scientific-sounding justification for the colonial hierarchies that already existed. The language itself literally builds the hierarchy. It really does. And that impulse to wrap prejudice in the language of science, it only got stronger. By the 19th century, the focus shifted from these sorts of philosophical descriptions to what they thought of as hard data. And this launched the whole era of craniometry, the measurement of skulls, which tried to legitimize racial bias with the appearance of objective science. And the leading guy doing this in America was a physician named Samuel George Morton.
Right, so Morton collected hundreds of human skulls from all over the world. And his method was, well, it was something. He'd fill them up with lead shot, then he'd pour that shot into a measuring cylinder to figure out the skull's internal volume, its cranial capacity. And his findings, surprise, surprise, always concluded that white Europeans had the biggest brains and were therefore the most intelligent. But here's the kicker. Decades later, the biologist Stephen Jay Gould went back and re-examined Morton's original data, and he found it was just riddled with unconscious bias. Morton had subconsciously packed the European skulls tighter, or he'd left out smaller samples, all to get to the conclusion he already believed was true. The crucial point here, Anya, is that the conclusion always came before the measurement. The data was just shaped to fit the prejudice.
And that brings us directly to our modern parallel then. Today, we are again in an era of intense measurement. But instead of skulls, we're measuring the genetic code of human embryos. The main tool for this happens during in vitro fertilization, or IVF, and it's called pre-implantation genetic testing, or PGT.
Okay, so for years, PGT has been used in a couple of standard ways.
As you can see on the table, PGTA screens for major chromosomal errors, things that can prevent an embryo from implanting at all. Then there's PGT-M, which is more specific. It tests for single gene disorders like cystic fibrosis. But the real game changer, and this is the direct modern echo of Morton's work, is the one we've highlighted, PGT-P. This stands for Pre-Implantation Genetic Testing for Polygenic Risk. It doesn't give you a simple yes or no answer. Instead, it generates what's called a polygenic risk score. It analyzes thousands of tiny genetic variations to create a literal scorecard that ranks embryos based on their probable risk for complex stuff like heart disease, diabetes, and it even predicts potential for traits like height and IQ. You're listening to OOTO with research by El Campesino.
So we've gone from measuring skulls to scoring embryos. And of course, Ben, these ideas of ranking and hierarchy, they didn't stay in the lab back then, and they aren't now. At the turn of the 20th century, these eugenics theories jumped from academic papers into aggressive state policy. And while a lot of people immediately think of Nazi Germany when they hear eugenics, it's a critical historical fact that the United States was actually a global pioneer in writing eugenics into law.
This timeline here, it just shows how deeply institutionalized this whole movement became in America. You had the Eugenics Record Office providing the pseudoscientific blueprint for policy. The whole campaign really hit its legal peak in 1927 with the infamous Supreme Court case Buck versus Bell. The case was about a young woman named Carrie Buck who'd been put in a state institution. The state of Virginia wanted to forcibly sterilize her, claiming that she, her mother, and her daughter were all feeble-minded, and the court agreed with the state. And the justification, which was written by Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., is just one of the most chilling lines in American legal history. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. With just those 8 words, the U.S. Supreme Court basically codified biological exclusion into federal law, and that decision opened the floodgates. By the 1930s, more than 30 states had compulsory sterilization laws, and this American legal precedent, it didn't go unnoticed. The architects of Nazi Germany's racial hygiene laws looked directly to American programs, especially California's, as a working model for their own industrial-scale purification programs.
And that brings us right up to the modern echo. The impulse to purify, it hasn't just vanished, Anya. It's just privatized. The mechanism isn't the brute force of the state anymore. It's the subtle, persuasive power of the consumer market. It's not about a government mandate, it's about a consumer choice, at least for those who can afford it.
Exactly, Ben. Today, PGTP is not a government program. It's a premium service offered by commercial companies. You can see some of them here, like Genomic Prediction, Orchid Health, and Myome. Now, these services are, by their very nature, incredibly expensive. They're accessible almost exclusively to affluent clients who can already afford the huge cost of IVF to begin with. So what you get is a marketplace where embryos with undesirable risk scores are simply deselected. It's a kind of market-driven purification. Instead of the state deciding who's unfit to reproduce, the market is empowering those with the money to select for what they consider to be the most fit genetic profile.
So up to this point in our investigation, we've mostly been talking about what Francis Galton, the founder of eugenics, called negative eugenics, which is all about preventing the so-called unfit from reproducing. But he was also a huge champion of positive eugenics, the idea of actively encouraging the fittest people in society to have more kids. This was all about proactively breeding a better human, which led to these surreal things like fitter family contests at state fairs, where families were literally judged on their supposed genetic health, just like livestock.
And for 100 years, Anya, that dream of actively engineering a better human was basically a fantasy. PGTP lets you select from the options you have, but it doesn't change the options themselves. But now we've taken a quantum leap in technology. We are moving from merely selecting the best available embryo to actively designing one by rewriting its fundamental code. And that changes absolutely everything.
And the tool that makes all this possible is called CRISPR-Cas9. It's a totally revolutionary gene editing technology that was actually discovered as part of a bacterial immune system. Scientists have figured out how to repurpose it into what is basically a word processor for DNA. The Cas9 protein is like a pair of molecular scissors, and it's guided to a very specific spot in our 3 billion letter genetic code by a guide RNA, which acts like a search function. Once it gets there, it makes a clean cut. And at that point, scientists can delete genes or even paste in new genetic sequences. Its precision has made what was literally science fiction into a laboratory reality.
And that reality arrived with an absolute shockwave in November of 2018. A scientist in China, He Jiankui,
announced that he had created the world's first gene-edited babies, twin girls named Lulu and Nana. He used CRISPR to disable a gene called CCR5, trying to make them resistant to HIV. Now, this wasn't just some experiment. This was a permanent, heritable germline edit. The changes he made to their DNA will be passed down to their children and all their descendants. He crossed a monumental ethical line that most of the scientific world had agreed not to cross, and it sparked a global firestorm. It was really the point of no return.
And this comparison here just brilliantly illustrates that fundamental shift. PGTP, which is selection, is all about choosing the best option from the genetic hand you're dealt by the parents. CRISPR, which is design, is about rewriting the options themselves. One works with the material you have, the other alters the material forever. It's such a profound ethical leap, Ben. We're no longer just choosing a path on the map. We're redrawing the map for everyone who comes after us. You're listening to OO with research by El Campesino. While this leap from selection to design connects us straight back to that original eugenics dream of creating a masterclass. And this isn't just some historical footnote. You have modern figures like the late financier Jeffrey Epstein who were openly fascinated with these ideas. His documented interest in transhumanism, his alleged plan to seed the human race with his own DNA from his Zorro ranch in New Mexico, it was a direct, if totally bizarre, echo of Francis Galton's goal, not just to improve humanity, but to design and breed a superior caste.
And this, Anya, this leads us to the central dilemma of this new era, the question right here on the screen. Therapy or enhancement? I mean, using CRISPR to fix a devastating single-gene disorder like Huntington's disease, that feels pretty clearly therapeutic, right? But what about using it to reduce the risk for heart disease from, say, 50% down to 5%? Is that therapy or is that enhancement? What about tweaking genes to maybe increase IQ potential by a few points? The line gets incredibly blurry, incredibly fast. And that ambiguity, that's the gateway to a new genetic class system, a biological divide between the enhanced and the natural. And this entire trajectory, Ben, it all points to one ultimate risk, the loss of what you could call our biological sovereignty. And to really get the stakes here, it's actually helpful to look at a concept from theology, the idea that human beings are created imago Dei, which means in the image of God. Now, this concept says that human life has an inherent sacred value that exists completely separate from its utility or its physical traits. The new techno-eugenics presents a radical and I think challenging alternative worldview.
This table really nails that fundamental shift in worldview. In the theistic view, our origin is as a creation, imago Dei. Our DNA is a sacred blueprint. But in this transhumanist view, our origin is a manufacturing process, imago Homo, in the image of man. And in this view, our DNA is not a sacred text. It's programmable code. Death isn't a spiritual transition. It's a technical glitch that needs to be solved. And most importantly, our status as individuals shifts from a sovereign creation to a proprietary product of design. The human body becomes hardware, and our genetic code becomes software that can be debugged, upgraded, patented, and ultimately owned.
Which leaves us with this final and I think pretty haunting question for our investigation today. Are we sovereign creations or proprietary products? The long arc that we've traced all the way from Linnaeus categorizing races to Morton measuring skulls to a modern clinic ranking embryos on a genetic scorecard, it has always been about one thing: control. The tools have become infinitely more sophisticated, but the underlying impulse, it remains exactly the same. And the final battle may not be over land or resources, but over the very definition of what it means to be human. I'm Dr. Ben Carter, and I'm Dr. Anya Sharma. Thanks for joining our Odo investigation.